Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, I want to explore something that touches all of our lives in ways we might not even realize. It's a psychological pattern that explains why sometimes people seem to have it out for us, no matter what we do, and why we ourselves might carry anger toward people who don't really deserve it. This is about understanding how our emotions can get tangled up, redirected, and pointed at the wrong targets entirely. This whole idea came to me during a casual conversation. My partner and I were in the car, just chatting about stories we love. She posed an interesting challenge. She asked me to think about certain fictional characters and what might be going on beneath the surface of their behavior. One character in particular caught our attention, someone who shows up as antagonistic from the very beginning, who seems impossible to please or win over no matter what anyone does. When I started analyzing this character's psychology, I realized he was carrying around something I see constantly in my therapeutic work, something called displaced anger or displaced hatred. Paint a picture for you. Imagine a scenario where someone meets another person and from day one, nothing this second person does is right. They could be polite. They could excel at everything. They could go above and beyond, and somehow it only makes things worse. The hatred intensifies. This creates such a confusing dynamic because the person being targeted often racks their brain trying to figure out what they did wrong. They go through every interaction, analyzing their words and actions, searching for the mistake they made. But here's the thing, they didn't make a mistake. The anger being directed at them has nothing to do with them at all. This resonates with us so deeply because most of us have experienced it. We've all had moments where someone treated us unfairly, where no matter what we did, we couldn't win their approval or even their basic kindness. We felt that confusion, that frustration, sense of injustice. And what makes this even more important to understand is that we ourselves are probably doing this to others without realizing it. We're probably carrying anger that belongs somewhere else and unconsciously directing it toward people who don't deserve it. Let's dig into this character to understand the mechanism at work. This person had one relationship in his life that mattered more than anything else. There was someone who showed him kindness when the rest of the world was cruel. This person became everything to him, the center of his emotional universe. He fell deeply, completely in love. In his mind, this person represented hope, beauty, acceptance, everything good that existed in his otherwise difficult life. But then something happened that he experienced as the ultimate betrayal. The person he loved made a choice. She chose to be with someone else. Not just anyone else, but specifically someone who had been cruel to him, who had bullied him, someone he considered an enemy. She didn't just date this person casually. She married him. She built a life with him. She had children with him. Every single one of those choices was like a knife twisting in his heart. Now, put yourself in his position for a moment. Imagine you're isolated, perhaps struggling socially, and there's one person who sees you, really sees you, and treats you with genuine kindness. You fall in love. You invest all your emotional hope in this connection. And then this person chooses to spend their life with the very person who makes your life miserable. How would that feel? The sense of rejection would be crushing. The feeling of betrayal would be immense. You would feel anger, profound anger at the person you love. And here's where displaced anger comes into play. This is the critical psychological mechanism we need to understand. Our minds are sophisticated instruments, but they're not always logical. One thing our brains really struggle with is holding contradictory emotions about the same person simultaneously. We can't easily love someone and hate them at the same time. These feelings create what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, a mental discomfort that our brains desperately want to resolve. So what happens when we find ourselves in this impossible situation? We've already committed to the belief that we love this person. We've told ourselves they're wonderful, kind, beautiful, amazing. Story is already written in our minds. We can't easily rewrite it. But we also feel this intense hatred because of their choices, because of how deeply they've hurt us. Our brain needs to resolve this conflict, does so through a process called projection or displacement. Instead of directing our anger where it actually belongs toward the person who hurt us, we redirect it. We displace it onto someone else, someone we've already decided is acceptable to hate. In this character's case, he takes all that rage and betrayal he feels toward the woman he loves, and he points it at her husband. He tells himself that the husband is the villain, the one who stole her away, the one who ruined everything. The husband becomes the container for all his pain. But it doesn't stop there, because then children enter the picture. Every time this character looks at her child, what does he see? He sees evidence. Evidence of her choice. Evidence that she chose someone else. Evidence that she built a life that doesn't include him. The child has his father's features, his father's mannerisms, his father's characteristics, but he also has his mother's eyes. Those eyes, the same eyes this character fell in love with, now stare back at him from the face of a child who represents everything he lost. Child becomes another target for displaced anger. The child hasn't done anything wrong. The child is just existing, just being himself. To this character, the child is a walking reminder of rejection, a living symbol of the life that could never be. No matter what the child does, the character hates him. If the child is ordinary, he's scorned. If the child is exceptional, he's hated even more because he's proving that the union that created him was successful. The choice to be with someone else was the right choice. This is displaced anger in its purest form. The anger doesn't belong to the people it's being directed at. It belongs to someone else entirely who cannot be hated without creating too much psychological pain. So the anger finds another home, another target, another outlet. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like a fictional scenario, something that happens in stories, but not in real life. But I can tell you from years of working with people as a therapist that this pattern is everywhere. It's one of the most common dynamics I encounter, and it's often the hidden key to understanding why people can't move forward, why they stay stuck in patterns of anger and resentment that seem impossible to break. Let me share how this often shows up in therapy. I had a mentor early in my training who gave me a piece of advice that changed how I understand family dynamics. He told me that when someone comes in and spends all their time talking about one parent, complaining about one parent, focusing all their energy on processing their relationship with one parent, the real therapeutic work isn't with that parent at all. The real healing, the real breakthrough happens when you start exploring the parent they're not talking about. This confused me at first. It seemed counterintuitive. I had someone come in who told me they had a traumatic childhood. They described having a parent who struggled with alcoholism, who would come home intoxicated, who would yell and rage, who created an unstable and frightening home environment. As a young therapist, I thought I had identified the problem. This is the trauma. This is what we need to process. This is the parent we need to talk about. So we spent sessions, months of sessions, talking about this parent. We explored the drinking, the yelling, the unpredictability, the fear. We processed the memories, the feelings, the impact. Something wasn't clicking. The person wasn't getting better. They were engaged in therapy. They were doing the work, but they weren't experiencing the relief or the breakthrough that should come from processing trauma. They were stuck. I brought this to my supervisor, confused about why our work wasn't producing results. And that's when he told me to look at the other parent we weren't discussing. I pushed back. I told him that when I asked about the other parent, the response was always positive. Parent was described as kind, as caring, as protective. That parent was the good one in the story. And my supervisor said exactly, that's the problem. That's where the displaced anger lies. He had me explore this in the next session. And what emerged was illuminating. The person told me a story that illustrated the dynamic perfectly. There was an incident where they received a lower grade on a test. Not even a failing grade, just not the highest grade. Alcoholic parent became enraged and decided that the appropriate punishment was to lock them out of the house for the night. The logic was that if they couldn't fulfill their responsibility to get top grades, they didn't deserve the shelter and care the family provided. This young person was forced to sleep outside as punishment. Eventually, the alcoholic parent passed out from drinking, as was typical. And then the other parent, the kind parent, came outside. But she didn't bring the child back into the house. She didn't confront the alcoholic parent or override the punishment. Instead, she brought out a sleeping bag so the child wouldn't have to sleep directly on the ground. In her mind, she was being helpful, being kind, being protective within the constraints she felt she had. And in the story this person told themselves for years, that act reinforced the narrative. One parent was the villain, cruel and abusive. The other parent was the hero, kind and protective. Underneath that story, buried under layers of rationalization and cognitive dissonance, was a different truth. Immense anger toward the kind parent, because that parent failed in the most fundamental way. A parent's job is to protect their child, and this parent, rather than protecting, enabled the abuse. She stood by. She watched. She waited until it was safe for her, and then she made a small gesture that didn't actually address the real problem. The child needed someone to say, no, this punishment is not happening. The child needed someone to stand up to the alcoholic parent and say, you cannot treat our child this way. The child needed protection, real protection, not a sleeping bag delivered after the danger had passed. But recognizing that anger, feeling that anger toward the kind parent was psychologically impossible. How can you be angry at the person who brought you a sleeping bag? How can you hate the person who was also a victim of the abusive parent? How can you blame someone who was trying their best under difficult circumstances? The mind does what it always does with unbearable contradictions. It displaces the anger, all that rage, all that hurt, all that sense of abandonment gets piled onto the parent who's already designated as the bad one. The alcoholic parent becomes the container for all the anger, including the anger that actually belongs to the enabling parent. This displacement is why the therapy wasn't working. We were processing anger toward the wrong target. We were trying to heal a wound by focusing on the obvious injury while ignoring the deeper betrayal. The person would talk about how the enabling parent did the best she could, how she was trapped in a difficult situation, how she was also being abused, how she didn't have resources or options. And all of that might be true. But it's also true that a child needed protection and didn't receive it. Both things can be true simultaneously. And until we could acknowledge the anger toward the enabling parent, until we could sit with that uncomfortable contradiction, the healing couldn't happen. This is the essence of displaced anger. We take feelings that are too painful or too complicated to direct at their actual source, and we redirect them towards someone else. And once we understand this mechanism, we start seeing it everywhere. We see it in families, in workplaces, in friendships, in romantic relationships, in our own internal emotional landscape. Let me talk about how this shows up in your life right now, because I guarantee it is showing up. First, there's a very good chance that someone in your life is directing displaced anger at you. Think about situations where you feel like you can't win with someone. You're polite, they're cold. You excel, they're resentful. You try to help, they're dismissive. Nothing you do seems to improve the relationship, and in fact, sometimes your positive actions seem to make things worse. This is incredibly confusing when you're experiencing it because you keep searching for what you did wrong. You analyze every interaction. You wonder if you're being too sensitive or misreading the situation. You try different approaches. You try being friendlier, then you try giving them space, then you try being professional, then you try being warm. Nothing works. And the reason nothing works is because the problem isn't actually about you. You're not doing anything wrong. You're just the target for anger that belongs somewhere else. This happens constantly in workplace dynamics. Imagine a situation with 3 people, a boss, and 2 employees. The boss is creating a toxic work environment. Maybe they're playing favorites. Maybe they're setting impossible standards. Maybe they're micromanaging. Maybe they're just incompetent. One employee is suffering under this leadership. They're stressed, they're frustrated, they're angry. They can't direct that anger at the boss because the boss has power over them. The boss controls their livelihood, their career advancement, daily experience at work. Expressing anger toward the boss feels dangerous, and often it is dangerous. So what happens? Employee starts directing their anger at their coworker instead. Suddenly you, the coworker, become the problem. You're not pulling your weight. You're getting preferential treatment. You're not being a team player. You're taking credit for shared work. The accusations might vary, but the emotional intensity is the same. You're experiencing someone else's displaced anger that actually belongs to the boss, but can't safely be directed there. And here's why understanding this is so important. When you don't recognize displaced anger for what it is, you waste enormous amounts of energy trying to fix a problem that isn't yours to fix. You try to be kinder to the coworker. You try to be more accommodating. You offer to help with their projects. You listen to their complaints. You go out of your way to be supportive.
Mm.
And none of it works because you're trying to solve the wrong problem. You're trying to address anger that has nothing to do with you. So no action you take will resolve it. I've worked with so many people who exhaust themselves trying to win over someone who has displaced anger toward them. They bend over backward. They sacrifice their own boundaries. They take on responsibilities that aren't theirs. They accept blame for things they didn't do. And it never works. It can't work. You can't fix a problem you didn't create. You can't heal a wound that isn't about you. Once you understand that displaced anger is at play, the healthiest response is to stop trying so hard. Make sure you're conducting yourself appropriately and professionally, yes. Don't drain yourself trying to change someone's perception of you when that perception is based on emotions that have nothing to do with you. Take on responsibility for someone else's unresolved anger. Don't let yourself become the dumping ground for feelings that belong elsewhere. This doesn't mean being cold or unkind. It means having boundaries. It means recognizing that you're not responsible for managing someone else's displaced emotions. It means conserving your energy for relationships where your efforts can actually make a difference, relationships where the dynamics are about you and the other person, not about you standing in as a proxy for someone else. Here's the even more uncomfortable truth. Not only is someone probably directing displaced anger at you, you're almost certainly directing displaced anger at someone else. If you have persistent anger in your life, if there's someone you just can't stand, if you have a nemesis who seems to embody everything wrong with the world, a good chance that some of that anger is displaced. Now, if this person has genuinely wronged you, if they've actually done things that warrant your anger, that's different. But often, when we dig deeper, we find that the intensity of our anger is disproportionate to what the person actually did. Or we find that we're angry at them for things that we excuse in other people. We find that our anger toward them never diminishes no matter what they do or how much time passes. These are all signs that we might be dealing with displaced anger. This is especially common in families. If you have a strong preference for one parent over another, be curious about that. If your parents clearly favored one child over another, be curious about the dynamics underneath that preference. If you have a sibling you can't stand while loving another sibling dearly, be curious about whether displaced anger might be involved. The pattern often looks like this. One person in the family system is designated as the problem, the difficult one, the one who causes all the trouble. And another person is seen as the good one, the easy one, the one who never causes problems. But when you dig beneath the surface, you often find that the good one is actually the source of significant pain, but pain that's too threatening to acknowledge. Maybe the good parent was absent physically or emotionally, but absence feels harder to blame than active harm. Maybe the favored sibling got all the attention and resources, but feeling jealous or angry toward them creates too much guilt. Maybe the good partner in a relationship is withholding or controlling, but those behaviors are subtle enough that naming them feels unfair. All that anger gets redirected toward someone else, someone who's already acceptable to blame. Me give you a specific example of how this plays out. Worked with multiple people who would describe themselves as having intense anger toward an entire group of people based on gender. They would express really hostile views, really generalized negative beliefs about women specifically. When we'd explore where this came from, the story they tell was about rejection, about feeling invisible, believing that this group of people had collectively decided they weren't worthy of attention or love. But here's the thing. The vast majority of people in that group hadn't actually done anything to them. Most had simply lived their own lives, declined romantic interest, which is their absolute right to do. Some had set boundaries, which is healthy, simply not noticed them, which happens to everyone all the time. But the anger was enormous, far bigger than the actual experiences would justify. So where was the displaced anger coming from? In many cases, it was coming from one of two sources. First, there was often one specific person, one woman who had been genuinely kind to them, mattered enormously to them, who had represented hope and connection. And then that person had moved on with her life. She dated other people, built relationships with other people, maybe gotten married, maybe had children. And my clients felt betrayed, abandoned, left behind. But hating that one person, the one kind person, created too much cognitive dissonance. She had been good to them. How could they hate her for living her own life, for making her own choices? The contradiction was unbearable. Instead of feeling anger toward that one person, they displaced it onto an entire gender. Every woman became a stand-in for the one woman who they felt had abandoned them. Original character I mentioned earlier is a perfect example of this dynamic. The one kind person chooses someone else rather than directing anger at her for that choice. Anger gets displaced onto her partner and eventually onto anyone who reminds him of that relationship. But there's also a second source of displaced anger that's even more painful to recognize. Often, the anger is actually directed at themselves. Loathing is real and it's powerful. These individuals often have profound struggles with self-esteem. They look in the mirror and hate what they see. They review their social interactions and cringe at their own behavior. They compare themselves to others and find themselves lacking in every way. The anger they feel toward themselves is intense. Here's the problem with self-directed anger. When you sit in self-hatred, when you beat yourself up constantly, when you direct all your rage inward, what happens? You become depressed. There's actually a classic psychological theory that suggests depression is anger turned inward. When we rage at ourselves, we don't rise up to change our circumstances. We collapse. We withdraw. We stop trying. We stay in bed. We give up. Directed anger leads to an action, and an action doesn't solve anything. So what does the mind do instead? It takes that self-loathing and projects it outward. Now, instead of hating myself, I hate them. Instead of being angry at my own perceived failures, I'm angry at the people who I believe rejected me or didn't give me a chance, didn't see my worth. And anger directed outward feels more productive than anger directed inward. When I'm angry at someone else, I feel motivated. I feel justified. I feel like I need to take action to fight back, to prove them wrong. The displacement of self-hatred onto others serves a psychological function. It converts depression into anger, inaction into motivation. It's still displaced. It's still not addressing the actual source of the pain. And in extreme cases, this displaced anger can lead to genuinely harmful actions. When someone takes their self hatred and projects it onto an entire group of people, when they start building ideologies around that displaced anger, when they start connecting with others who share that displacement, it can escalate into something dangerous. But even in less extreme cases, displaced anger keeps us stuck. It keeps us from doing the actual work of healing. It keeps us focused on the wrong targets, fighting the wrong battles, trying to solve the wrong problems. And the solution, uncomfortable as it is, requires us to redirect our attention back to the actual source of our anger. So how do you work with displaced anger? How do you untangle it? The process starts with one crucial question: who am I not allowed to be angry with? Or to put it another way, who do I love and appreciate so much that I can't let myself feel any negative emotions toward them? This is the key that unlocks displaced anger. We need to identify the people in our lives who we've placed on pedestals, who we've decided are only good, who we've protected from our anger even when they've hurt us. These are often people we genuinely care about, people who have genuinely done good things for us, people who we don't want to blame or resent. But that doesn't mean they've never hurt us. It doesn't mean they've never let us down. It doesn't mean they've never made choices that caused us pain. Looking at the people you admire most, the people you feel most grateful toward, people you would describe as having been there for you. And then ask yourself with real honesty, what did this person do that hurt me? What did they do that let me down? When did they fail to protect me? When did they make a choice that benefited them but harmed me? Did they stand by and let something happen that shouldn't have happened? This is incredibly uncomfortable work. Our minds will resist it. We'll come up with all kinds of rationalizations and excuses. They did the best they could. They were dealing with their own struggles. They didn't have other options. They didn't know better. They were in a difficult position. And all of those things might be true. They don't erase the impact on us. Someone can do the best they could and still hurt us, can be dealing with their own struggles and still fail to protect us. Both things can be true at once. The goal here isn't to demonize people who've been important to us. It's not to rewrite our entire history and decide that actually everyone was terrible. It's to develop a more complete, more nuanced, more honest understanding of our relationships. It's to acknowledge that people we love can also hurt us. It's to recognize that anger toward someone doesn't negate love for them, and love for someone doesn't negate anger toward them. We can hold both emotions simultaneously. Our minds resist this complexity, but it's where the truth lies. When we start doing this work, when we start acknowledging anger toward people we've protected from our anger, something remarkable happens. The free, floating rage starts to diminish. The intensity of our anger toward the people who've been our targets, our scapegoats, our containers for displaced emotion, that intensity starts to decrease. We start seeing those people more clearly, seeing them as they actually are rather than as symbols of something else. We start having more proportionate emotional responses to things. And we start being able to make different choices. Instead of staying stuck in patterns of anger that never resolve, we can actually address the real sources of our pain. Instead of exhausting ourselves trying to get people to see us differently when the problem was never about us, we can invest our energy in relationships that are actually mutual and reciprocal. Instead of carrying around rage that colors everything in our lives, we can start releasing it by directing it where it actually belongs and then working through it. Let me be clear about something. This work is hard. It's some of the hardest psychological work there is because it requires us to think differently about people who matter to us, about situations we've made peace with, about narratives we've spent years constructing. It requires us to get comfortable with ambiguity and contradiction. It requires us to feel anger we've been suppressing, sometimes for decades. It's also some of the most liberating work there is. When you realize that your anger towards someone has been displaced, you can stop wasting energy on a dynamic that was never going to resolve. When you redirect your anger back to its actual source, you can finally address it directly and work through it. When you acknowledge painful truths about people you love, you're no longer carrying around the weight of denying those truths. You can love them and be angry with them. You can appreciate what they gave you and acknowledge what they didn't. You can hold the full complexity of the relationship. When someone is directing displaced anger at you, understanding what's happening changes everything. You stop taking it personally, trying to fix something that isn't yours to fix, exhausting yourself trying to win someone over who isn't actually angry at you for anything you've done. You can maintain appropriate boundaries, conduct yourself with integrity, and let go of the outcome. Their anger is their work to do, not yours. I think about this dynamic constantly in my therapeutic work because it's so universal. Almost everyone I work with has some element of displaced anger in their emotional life. Sometimes it's the central issue. It's one thread among many, but it's almost always there if you look closely enough. And helping people recognize it, name it, and redirect it back to its source is consistently one of the most powerful interventions I can offer. We live in a world that often encourages displacement. We live in a culture that wants clear villains and heroes, gets uncomfortable with nuance and ambiguity, that prefers simple stories to complex truths. We're encouraged to keep some people on pedestals and others in the garbage. We're encouraged to simplify our emotions rather than sitting with their complexity. We're encouraged to find external targets for our rage rather than doing the harder work of examining its actual origins. Simple stories keep us stuck. Black and white thinking keeps us stuck, protecting certain people from our anger while dumping all of it on others keeps us stuck. And we deserve better than being stuck. We deserve to understand the full truth of our emotional lives, even when that truth is complicated and uncomfortable. We deserve to free ourselves from patterns that don't serve us. We deserve to live with less anger, less resentment, less misplaced rage. Invite you to sit with these questions. Is there someone in your life who seems to hate you or resent you no matter what you do? Consider the possibility that their anger has nothing to do with you. Consider stopping the exhausting work of trying to win them over. Maintain your integrity, but release the responsibility for their emotions. And even more importantly, is there someone in your life who you're persistently, disproportionately angry with? Is there someone who bothers you more than the situation warrants? Is there someone who you can't let go of your anger toward no matter how much time passes? If so, ask yourself who you're not allowed to be angry with. Who have you protected from your anger? Who have you placed on a pedestal? Who do you love so much that you can't let yourself feel any negative emotions toward them? The answer to that question, comfortable as it might be, is where your healing lies. That's where you can start untangling the displaced anger. That's where you can start feeling your emotions toward the right people, the actual sources of your pain. That's where you can start releasing the anger that's been weighing you down, coloring your perception, and keeping you stuck in patterns that don't serve you. This is deep work. This is lifelong work. This is work that requires courage and honesty and a willingness to sit with discomfort. But it's work worth doing, because on the other side of it is freedom. Freedom from carrying anger that doesn't belong to you. Freedom from being the target of other people's displaced rage. Freedom from staying stuck in emotional patterns that keep you small and stuck and suffering. Freedom to see people as they actually are in all their complexity. Freedom to feel the full range of your emotions without having to displace them to make them bearable. Freedom to build relationships based on truth rather than on the stories you need to tell yourself to survive. You deserve that freedom. You deserve to understand the intricate workings of your own emotional landscape. You deserve to release anger that's been misdirected and to address anger that's been suppressed. You deserve relationships where your efforts to connect and improve things actually make a difference, because the dynamics are about real interactions rather than displacement. You deserve to stop exhausting yourself trying to fix problems that aren't yours. And you deserve to stop being driven by anger that you don't even understand because you've never traced it back to its source. Journey to understanding displaced anger is the journey toward emotional clarity, toward psychological freedom, living with less rage and more peace. It's the journey toward seeing yourself and others with clear eyes, with compassion for complexity, with acknowledgement of both harm and care, both love and anger, both gratitude and grief. It's the journey toward being a whole person with whole emotions in relationship with other whole people with their own whole emotions. Journey, difficult as it is one of the most worthwhile journeys you can take. Every step toward understanding where your anger actually belongs is a step toward releasing it. Every moment of acknowledging painful truths about people you love is a moment of freeing yourself from the burden of denying those truths. Every time you recognize displaced anger, either directed at you or coming from you, you create the possibility of something different, healthier, something more honest. So take that step. Ask that question. Sit with that discomfort. At the people you've protected from your anger, and ask yourself what they did that hurt you. Look at the people you've blamed for everything and ask yourself what anger toward them might actually belong somewhere else. At the patterns in your emotional life and ask yourself where displacement might be at work. The answers won't always be comfortable. The process won't always be easy, but the liberation that comes from understanding the true sources of your anger, from redirecting it appropriately, from releasing what doesn't serve you, seeing clearly instead of through the distorted lens of displacement, that liberation is worth every uncomfortable moment of the journey. You deserve to live free from the weight of anger that was never really about what you thought about. You deserve to understand yourself at that deep level, and you deserve the peace that comes from that understanding. Thank you for taking this journey with me today. Thank you for being willing to look at these difficult dynamics. Thank you for considering the possibility that your anger and the anger directed at you might be more complex than it appears on the surface. The work of understanding displaced anger is the work of a lifetime, but every insight, every moment of recognition, every step toward emotional honesty brings you closer to the freedom and peace you deserve.